Welcome to the very first edition of The Square. My name is Dan Mpisi, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. I am joined by my lovely panelists today, and I'll introduce them. Just very briefly, I'm joined here with Charles Haber. Charles Haber runs Century Estate Limited, which is responsible for some of the lovely buildings you've seen in Kigali, such as Kigali Heights. He is also a renowned speaker, and many of you may know him from his days at Contact FM when he was in charge of a very popular show called Crossfire. Charles, is there something I've missed that you'd like to add?
Good evening. It's a very vibrant introduction, and I'm happy to be with you here.
Yes, so Charles is part of The Square. Also part of The Square is Bernard Namata. Bernard Namata is the bureau chief for Nation Media Group's biggest newspaper in East Africa, The East African. Bernard, is there
Thank you for having me. It's a privilege.
Great. And also joined, last but not least, is Ephraim Gwamyende, who is the CEO of Ra Business Group, which is a conglomerate of companies that trades, amongst other things, in petroleum, real estate, and commodities. Ephraim, welcome to the show. Is there something you'd like to add?
No, you've pretty much said everything. But
Yes.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And this, ladies and gentlemen, is The Square. First edition, we're really excited to be here. And tonight we are going to be talking about the recent reforms at the African Union. We've been posting this on our social media. We're excited to be here, first edition. And today the reforms that we're going to discuss focus on the new changes to the African Union, specifically under the chairmanship of the new chairperson, His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Rwanda, President Paul Kagame. These reforms focus on 4 key areas that I'd just like us to discuss, but I'd like to mention them first. The first is to focus on priorities within a continental scope. The second focus of these reforms is realigning African Union institutions to deliver on its priorities. The third is to manage the AU effectively at both political and operational level. And the fourth, and most important, and this is where we are going to be discussing on a large scale tonight, is self-financing the AU. Self-financing the African Union is very important, and it's one of the key aspects of these reforms. And this is because this is 2018, and it does not make sense that just in 2016, over 70% of the budget of the AU was actually covered by external donors. And this is something that we want to discuss, and we've heard your thoughts on social media. Self-financing is very important. But before we get into that, what does the AU mean to the common African, to the African person? And I would like to start with Charles, your opinion on this?
Thanks, Dan. I think it means quite a lot. You see, if you're to look at it from different aspects and say, first of all, the size of the market. You know what the Continental Free Trade Agreement offers to the common Rwandan is, first of all, it's a bigger market. You're talking about in excess of 1.2 billion people. So if you're to pick an item that you can sell, like matchboxes. So if you manufacture matchboxes, you potentially can sell your matchboxes to 1.2 billion people. So that's the first thing. That's the size of the market. The second thing is the GDP that you're looking at. You're looking at in excess of $2 trillion across the continent, and I think that's extremely huge, and there's nothing else you can compare it to. So those two aspects, combined with other factors like the opportunity to be able to move across the continent with ease, right? Because I think one of the arguments that one of the pointers that are being brought across in the new EU is free movement of people across the continent, and therefore you don't have to wait for 30 days for your visa to be approved to move from Cairo to Cape Town, you know, and a few of those others. So I think there's, personally, I'm quite optimistic about the new AU and the opportunities that it has to offer. Yeah.
I agree with you. The CFTA really does have the potential to propel this continent's development agenda to a greater scale, and it's already happening. In East Africa, you know, use your ID to travel across from here to Uganda and so forth and so on. But at the crux of this, as I mentioned, is self-financing. You know, in Rwanda, we keep on talking about agaciro, sustainability, self-reliance, and I feel like this conversation is being taken to a continental scale under the chairmanship of His Excellency, President Paul Kagame, self-financing at the AU. And at the heart of this is the 0.2% levy on all imports to all member states of the African Union. Ephraim, what's your take on that? What do you think is the impact, especially as a business person? What's your take on this?
I mean, it's, again, I know you said it, you're like, it's 2018 and we should be self-financed, and I think from day one we should have been self-financed. You talked about 70% of the budget being funded by external parties, and just to give a bit of context, it's a significant portion of what they call the program budget. Now, the program budget is what, or at least the programs are what the AU implement. These are the stuff that they go out and try to implement in different member states. And if an external party is funding this, obviously you know that somebody else's agenda is going to be put forth. I was being told by a colleague who has the privilege of attending the AU meetings in Addis, and apparently people just show up. People from these European countries who are not part of the member states just show up, and they actually cause a lot of discord amongst African countries. So the self-financing aspect is very critical, and we can't try to avoid it. We can't. It's an elephant in the room. I think they said that if all member states are to pay up, we're going to have about $1.2 billion. And our budget in 2016 was for about $400 million.
416.
416.
Yeah.
And when you look at it, it means that it's a sustainable plan. Again, the argument then comes in, why 0.2? I think, or why even a tax levy? I think genuinely the tax levy in itself is it's a way to help the member states honor this commitment. It targets the economic activity, or at least the economic engine of these states, by targeting imports, but then it's minuscule enough to be able to be sustained. However, we have had pushback, because if you're going to tell, again, agendas are trying to be pushed, especially by these people who are giving this money, so obviously they raise their heads and they're like WTO rules. Interestingly enough, the WTO clause that they claim that we're violating is most favored nations. So it's a clause called the most favored nations clause, the MNF clause. Basically, it says that we should not discriminate. And he talked about the continental free trade area. If we can create a free trade area as member states as well, you'd find that it would be easier it would be able to find our way past this. And what people don't actually understand is the EU in itself used this similar model to fund its activities, or even still uses it. So I genuinely think that self-financing is necessary, it's sustainable. We do have pushback, but there are ways around that. Yeah.
I agree, and we're going to come back to this issue. I know we've been discussing this prior to this show. We have a lot of opinions on this. We've listened to a social media, and a lot of people have opinion on this. We're definitely going to come back to this. But Brenna, one of the things that with these AU reforms is that it repositions us. It's aimed to reposition Africa as a continent to better leverage its interests. And in this vein, there's certain relationships that I think will change, specifically that with the EU. The EU, to just start with, is one of the biggest trading partners with Africa. All 28 member states of the EU are the biggest trading partners with Africa in terms of humanitarian and development support. How do you think this will change?
I think that the time has come for Africa to know who its real partners are, because it's easy to say, as European Union, that you support the African Union, but behind the scenes, you're actually not supporting. Now, this is the moment where we need to see our partners, like the European Union, embrace and support the agenda. It doesn't mean that we expect them to agree with everything, but we expect that they will not make it difficult for the African Union to implement most of the reforms. Because at the end of the day, if partnership is going to be useful, then it has to have some mutual, we need some mutual interests and be able to understand each other. So we are grateful that the European Union for a very long time, and indeed will continue to remain an important partner for the African Union, but we hope that in this whole reform process, we'll face less resistance from the member countries. And I would want to think that following what we've seen with Brexit, I don't think that the European Union is in a mood to lose another strong and influential partner as the African Union.
Yeah. So
I think the point, if I may, Diana,
Yes,
the point that Bana brings on board is extremely important in the sense that if you're to link it with the size of the African market, the 1.2 billion people plus I was talking about, that the importance of Africa as a trading partner makes more sense now to the EU more than ever.
Yeah.
yes.
And especially that we, if all goes according to plan, we will be a bloc. But traditionally, we have to remember that in addition to all this, in addition to the financial sustainability and the size of our economy as a bloc, you're going to have a situation where, one of the other recommendations I saw was that Africa will be determining who attends its meetings.
Yeah.
And,
Which should have been the agenda from the beginning,
yes.
you know?
Well, Ephraim mentioned it in passing and said anyone who wanted to come to the AU meetings would just show up anyhow. But I did read that we will be determining who is invited to our party and who isn't. And I think that's an extremely fundamental stride in the right direction. Yes.
So it's not like I want to play devil's advocate, but
It's fine.
A lot of the sentiments about these reforms is very optimistic, but a lot of people who are driving these reforms or people who believe in these reforms and the journey ahead have been accused of being like overly optimistic on a sort of honeymoon, mood of just thinking positively without really thinking deeply about the challenges ahead. And what is your opinion? What's our opinion on the square about some of these practical ideals that we need to actually focus on?
I'm both a pessimist and an optimist.
Of course.
So what does that make me?
Like any business, it makes you a normal business.
You're Swiss.
Maybe I'm Swiss. No, but it's there are two aspects. Let me start with the pessimistic approach first. We're talking about the European Union and we're talking about us, to a certain degree, we're a trade partner and us, once we self-finance, putting our foot down. But, one of the biggest challenges for the continent is illicit financial flows. In terms of, there's a lot of money that disappears through either tax, really complex tax structures, avoidance systems, transfer pricing,
especially by multinational corporations.
Yes,
well.
and what you see is that most of these companies are owned by European investors. Most of them. A significant portion of the players in our economies are European-owned businesses. And I think, yes, we may have some political will, but if the private sector if the private sector is also difficult, in this case, a European entity would want to protect its interests. If that's difficult, it also has a chance to put a wrench in our gears. Yeah. But on the other end, I can speak to the political will. I genuinely think that there's an interest. I found out recently, actually, that the peace fund, the peace fund that we have under the AU,
Led by Dr. Kaberuka.
yes, was 40. I think we had raised about almost $30 million, 29.5, which is about 45, just recently. Which is about 45% of the target. And this is coming from member states. I know we had a discussion earlier whether those member states were self-financing it, whether the funds were originating from them, but the fact of the matter was there's a desire. On the other end, the member contributions as of 2017 were the highest since the establishment of the fund in 1993. And 22 countries have already signed up for the 0.2 levy. It's just that they're going through the process, but and it's just been 1 year since the announcement of this particular reform. So you can see there's already political will. So on one end, I'm like, if the private sector is still in the hands of the European Union to a certain degree, so that's going to be a bit difficult. But on the optimistic end, I would say that the political will seems to be there.
I want to build, if I may, on the political will. I think that is going to be the game changer. And the political will have to be coupled by the big boys. The big boys have to come on board.
These are the big economies in Africa.
Yes, the
South
big
Africa,
economies.
and
South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria.
Exactly.
If you remember, I think around 2000, when the first reforms were happening, OAU was being changed into AU. That time you had the big boys, Thabo Mbeki, Bouteflika from Algeria, and Abdoulaye Wade. And that is when, you needed to have, like the big push syndrome. The three came and then the rest of the others jumped into the bandwagon. So even in the same breath, if the new AU and the financing reforms and all the other reforms are going to come into play, it will be extremely important that the big boys come to the party. That's the point I wanted to make here.
And that's not an easy one.
It's not.
Yes.
Yeah,
but on that vein as well, the new chairmanship under President Paul Kagame, and we'll discuss this after the break, but I'm curious to understand how he was selected. But personally, and this is a personal opinion, I would like to think it's because, this is a leader known for walking the talk, And if you look at us in 1994, after the genocide against the Tutsi, it was just, we were just completely devastated. And in just 2 decades, which in historical terms is really a blink of an eye, this country has transformed. It's transformative because of leaders who actually believe in this process. And I like to think, people probably looked at what this leadership has done for this country and has believed in taking it to a continental level. And as President Kagame has constantly said, we are running out of time. This is a process that should have started the day before yesterday and yesterday, And these are things that I think this attitude of urgency and also not thinking self-defeatist, Africa has been known as a continent whereby the agenda and even the people who believe in this continent has just been completely fatalistic in terms of attitude. And I think this
But there's a reason for that. There's a reason why
it's
people
time.
feel for a very long time we've had most of us Africans being disoriented, and this is largely because of their leadership. Most people are frustrated with the leadership in their countries. Now, I know it is difficult to explain to citizens in Rwanda that you can have failure of leadership, but
it's hard to explain in Rwanda because we do not have failure
Yes, because
of
it's difficult to explain because people haven't seen what it actually means under His Excellency President Kagame. And when you look at across Africa, the deficits of leadership now, it seems to be global. Eventually,
because these issues are not specific to Africa.
Yes.
It's a global
but
phenomenon.
But one thing we need to understand in terms of where the so-called defeatist kind of attitude is coming from is it's failure of leadership. If we can get the leadership in Africa to get their act together, I think people will begin to be optimistic. People will begin to see that indeed things can happen. And I think that's where the challenge is. If we can have everyone understand that a stronger, efficient African Union will work for everyone, I think you will have less and less of the pessimism that is around the reform process.
I think the point around the strong leadership is it cannot be really overemphasized. Diana, you asked yourself and answered yourself the question by wondering why could they have zeroed on to President Kagame. But let's also exercise this with a bit of caution. Building from the 22 members that Ephraim said have already committed. 22 out of 54 member states is less than 50%. Let's not ignore the fact that probably there are some people who are not willing to come to this party because the reforms are being driven by President Kagame. And therefore, whenever you're growing, you will hurt people along the way. When your business thrives, there will be your competitors who will not be happy. When RBA is growing or any other corporate or entity is growing, there will be some some few jealousy
Some
people,
pushback.
yeah, you know, who will not be happy about it, and therefore given an opportunity to frustrate you when you need them, they will seize it with both arms and legs. And I think that's really a very, very pertinent point, because people may not, there are some people who may not want to subscribe to this agenda because they look at it as Kagame's plan. There are some people who may not want to subscribe to this agenda because they look at Kaberuka's plan, which Kaberuka comes from Rwanda. And therefore they don't look at the merits of the plan, but they just look at the individuals driving it and they fight it from the onset. And that's a reality that none of us are about to change today, and we have to be ready to face it head on. Yes.
And also to add to that, you know, politically speaking, just also in terms of business, you know, a lot of the pushback from people on this, I'm just zeroing back on the self-financing plan, is importers who keep on, in Ghana, for instance, you know, they said, look, you've taxed us. They had a reform of taxes, I think, on the business community. So in this 0.2 was put there, you know, there's also pushback from private sector. Find another way to get this 0.2.
No, but let me just talk on that.
tax.
You know,
find another way to levy this, but not from us as a business community on imports.
You see, ad valorem tax, which is tax on imports like this, is actually a consumer tax. I know it seems like...
Can you break that down?
For
the likes of us who
in a sense
are not conversant with such things.
In a sense that if I'm an importer, right, and I add the 0.2%, when I sell it to the wholesaler, I'll just add the 0.2 into the pricing, and then he adds it. The person who eventually pays is the consumer. So what happens is that it's just that in this case, where we are the collection of tax is happening at the point of importation. But the person who actually carries that burden is the end consumer. And that is what needs to be communicated to the business community, that, look, I mean...
So when importers say, no, we're not for it, find another way of getting this financing.
It's the same as adding 0.2% to VAT.
Yes.
You get.
Yes.
But even VAT it's not as... Actually, this 0.2 on imports is purely a tax that the consumer has to pay, because even VAT, there's a portion that has to be paid from the business person. So you find that if business people actually sat down and looked at it, it's like a customs duty.
Dana, if I may just add one thing. If you look at our continent and the way it does business, we are actually a net importer. So even that puts us in a stronger position, because already internally we know that hopefully most countries are not importing the basics. So if you look at the import bill, either it's equipment or it's luxuries. So hopefully, you know, the shock will be less even internally because of that.
Okay. Well, we'll be back with more on the square, on the AU reforms and what they mean for the continent after the break. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Square. And now we're going to hear from our audiences on social media, specifically on Twitter. We've been having some opinions on the AU reforms, the new AU reforms under the leadership of President Paul Kagame. And the first is from Pierre Karinganire, who asks us, can you please give us the arguments of the countries who refuse to pay the 0.2 levy? I fail to understand them. It is not money from their budget. It is us, the people who support Africa. And just very quickly, I'll also read from one of the other people who also went on Twitter. And this is from Arnold Quizera, who asks us, I'll just combine his tweets because it more or less says the same thing. He says, 1 year is not enough time to see through many of the reforms needed. How does one make the AU relevant? And his second tweet is, just like the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, which was a predecessor to the AU, just like the AU, many Africans feel detached from the AU and its failure to tackle real issues. How does one change this narrative?
So let me talk on the relevance of, you know, I was told that, coming back to the self-financing thing, I was told that one of the donors who funded the AU really went in and wanted them to talk about autism as a program for the continent. And not to take anything away.
His agenda through.
A serious one. And not to take anything away from addressing the issue of autism. But I don't think that is necessarily the most pertinent issue that is facing our member states, at least as a collective. And this was a lot of money that this person pledged. And you see, we also have to forget, let's not also forget the aspect of time. Because these member states have to address that's why they talk of key priority areas. They have
That's
to
why
talk
they're
about
focusing on.
Yes, you need to, because
exactly.
you can't do everything. You can't solve all your problems. You need to start with the major ones, or at least the ones that you can solve immediately with the resources at your disposal, and get that off your plate. So I think the reason why the AU has kind of missed the mark in the past is because we're dancing to the tune of somebody else. And the day we start to self-finance is at least the first step towards addressing that issue.
And this is a relevance that Arnold was asking
Yeah,
about. How do we make ourselves relevant? We need to be able to set the tune to our own agenda.
Exactly.
And that is because we are
self-financed.
Exactly.
If I could respond to the question around what's the rationale for countries that are resistant to pay it, I think we have to be aware that for most countries, they're still thinking nationalistically, so you'll have strategic national interests come into play in this whole decision-making process. But we hope that they will see that the rationale in a stronger African Union, as opposed to prioritizing, a bit of, national interests here and there, because, a country like South Africa probably would want to protect its relationship with Europe because it's doing more business with Europe. But I think all these could be addressed if we are able to get the good political will that we need to run through the whole reform process. So it's not going to be easy, and I'm glad that this person raised that, because it's a key issue, because historically, even when you look at the decision-making process within the AU, partly why it has been frustrating to get consensus is because you have some countries that are prone to manipulation by partners, so they will come to Addis and they agree this thing, and then you have these partners, behind the scenes manipulating some of these countries. So hopefully we'll see less of that. But again, that can only happen if we have a stronger African Union.
It's not even behind the scenes.
Blatant.
Guys are in the corridors at the AU and are telling these guys in their ear, in front of one another, that don't agree to what they're saying. That's the level at which it has reached, and it's actually a bit disgusting, because it's like these people have no respect for us and have no respect for our own personal agenda to better ourselves. They're just like, these people, we can manipulate them as long as we give them a bit of cash.
And I like the way you said, if someone tells you your rent, you remember that analogy you gave, if someone says, Berna, Charlie, Diana, Ephraim, we live in one house and we all contribute to rent. If someone comes and says, your rent today is $500, but pay what you can. What's going to happen?
No,
I'll pay what I can.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day,
and probably that person will send you on a holiday to think about what you can, and while you are away, he will wire your house and listen to the conversation that you have.
But that's wiretapping.
It was played. I think it was handled very well.
Yeah, but do you really think it happened?
I'm not armed with enough ammunition to know whether the AU headquarters were wired by the Chinese or not.
But it was curiously strategic. The way it came out from the Le Monde in France, the timing. And it was only publication that pushed forward.
But then also on the flip side,
in the first place, we shouldn't be having that discussion of someone sponsoring our key building. Why didn't we build it in the first place?
As President Kagame said, he
why
said in January at the AU summit, this building should not even have been built in the first place by people other than Africans.
No, let me give you a bit of context as well, because we've talked about the EU in relation to Africa. China, do you know, apparently of $7.5 billion of Kenya's debt, 5.2 or 5 billion of it is owned by China. It's crazy. So at the end of the
I
day,
I wouldn't say that it's crazy.
no, I would say
it's crazy,
no,
Maria.
as a
How is it not
percentage.
crazy?
No. I mean, it depends on why Kenya feels that China is a better place to borrow. I mean, as a businessman, I'm sure you know this, the cost of borrowing, there are so many issues that influence who you decide, where you decide to borrow.
But you see, the bit about spreading risk is that it minimizes the amount of influence one particular investor has in your business.
That's
So
almost
if
70%
if you can, I mean,
country.
I would say that if I was China and I built the AU building with all the money I have invested in all the African countries, I would want to know what goes on with my money. I mean, it's a simple thing. So
I think it's a legitimate issue to discuss. We shouldn't bury ourselves in the sand and just wash it away. But I think the broader issue is that we are having emerging partners, in a way we are diversifying the sort of partnership we have. For instance, instead of just depending on the EU, now we have China, we have Turkey, and the question that is facing us right now is, do we know what we want from these partners? Yeah. Are we going to have the same sort of dependency syndrome that we've had with other partners? Yeah. Are we able to say we are now at a point where we can drive an agenda with the new partners? Because, I mean, China is not in the business of donations and, it's not an NGO. They're not in charity,
Yes.
So,
of course.
Whatever at the end of the day that China is able to do and get away with, it's our problem.
Yeah.
And until we sit as Africans and sort our house and be able to know what we want under what conditions, then we can't blame China. China is,
China is just
it's happy to do business with anyone.
China is like a credit card company.
A credit card company, exactly.
Yeah, because for them, they
unlimited, but
they give you
at
the
end
card.
of the day,
if you don't know how to manage your credit card debt,
Exactly.
and you don't know how to manage your spending, you find yourself in problems. But I think more than anything, I believe new partners, because Europe has probably been our longest partner. From an aid front, the US has really put in a lot of money. But it's good to see different people come in who say, okay, let's do business together. I just hope that the net benefit, because China invests a lot into our commodities, by the way, and I don't know if you know that.
Yes.
For them, they'll build a railway from the mining company to the port. And they'll say we're investing $2 billion to build a railway. Now, that's the headline. But then when you read the fine print, it's just from the mine all the way to the port, so that they can export the iron ore.
I think
and all
you raise a very fundamental issue. If you look at our trade, for instance, with China, it's still heavily dominated by raw commodities, which means we are shipping all the value to China. That has to change. Yeah.
You know,
but it's not up to China, it is up to us.
I don't know if it's true, but I remember a couple of years back reading that, I don't know which Southern African country it was, I don't know if it was Zambia or Malawi, I can't remember, but they were actually taking soil in containers back to China, literally taking the land. And obviously there was agreed upon.
That's actually, forget about even that. Just the other day, we had the Chinese being appointed in national police. You must have seen this outrage, online. And we're not saying we shouldn't have
foreigners,
but we just need to
dictate our agenda.
Yes, we need to know what we want. And also, I think there's always a risk creating a dependency with these partners. Because what we saw, for instance, with the 2008 global financial crisis, most of our countries were feeling the shock. Why? Because our exports were mainly to Europe. Yeah. And when these economies had shocks, we didn't know what to do. Now it is changing. When China is in trouble, most African countries, begin to sneeze, as they say. And you know why? Because now increasingly we're doing more business with China. Yeah. So in 2014, for instance, when China was having, some bit of shocks in the economy, African countries were beginning to feel the shock too. And this is something we have to be conscious about, and our governments have to address.
And I think a topic that I'll just put it out there, and maybe we can revisit this in the future. We have talked about the political will towards a reformed a African Union. An African Union is not the politicians or the government structures alone. It is it's our economies in general. It's our societal fabrics in general. My question is, how can we build capacity of our local industries? Because again, what I'm seeing,
this is a timeless question for Africa.
No, but you see, the question is we've just talked about how personally, I'm talking about my sector.
What's your sector?
Sugar. Commodities, sugar. A lot of those people in those sectors, like the Totals, the Associated British Foods with the Ilovo sugar, all of those guys are European companies. Now, what's happening is that the Chinese are coming in, like I know in Zambia, the Chinese are setting up a mill for sugar. They're going to compete with Zambia, but it's still owned by
Chinese.
By the Chinese. It's another partner. What happens in that situation is that we've just changed one, I don't want to say that, but one devil for another, you know? We've changed one negative for another negative, in the sense that why can't it be a local Zambian or a fellow African investing in setting up a mill? You know, and the question, that's for me is, if we're going to talk about reform and we're going to talk about
it has to be
a complete overhaul.
No, you raise a very important issue. I'll give you an example. Over the years, we've seen the Kitenge kind of, revive.
Kente cloth, Kitenge.
Yes, and it's now worn by the elite.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, we need to find out who is actually manufacturing the Kitenge that we are wearing.
Yeah.
It is African, but the production is not in Africa. And that's the tragedy, you know?
I'd like to just steer the conversation a bit. Absolutely, capacity is a must. It's a timeless conversation, and we are running out of time. These are things that, from paper, they have to, be implemented. But I'd just like us to discuss just briefly. 2018, we are not even at the end of the quarter of this year, but there have been dramatic changes in leadership. We've seen the resignation of South African President Jacob Zuma, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe, and so have you. And in regards to the African Union, because this is leadership, and I'd like to put this to you, Brenna, what do you think this signifies? Is there a new wave of leadership in terms of these resignations are because Africans have spoken and said, we want change? What's your take on this wave of leadership change?
My personal sense is that it's too early to tell.
Yes, it is.
I don't entirely agree that it's driven, this whole process of resignations is driven by massive change. Like, you have many people in these countries driving the change. I don't think so. What you have is change that's come because of, partly in most of these countries, functioning political parties that still have control. But I think the broader issue is that for leadership, the challenge is if you're not able to address the structure issues, and by structure issues I mean access to jobs, improve access to healthcare, the day-to-day needs of ordinary people, I think the changes that we're seeing will continue to happen, but at the end of the day, they will not make us a better continent. The only celebration I think that we can have right now as Africans with the recent change in leadership is we are seeing less bloodshed. And
there's a transition, but there's no violence.
Yes.
Traditionally,
it's less
attached to the continent.
Yes, it's less chaotic. Now that gives us hope, but we feel that this could be managed better. It shouldn't take a decade to have a leader be forced to resign. I mean, look at the cost over 10 years. What that does to the ordinary person on the streets. It shouldn't take that. I wish and I hope African leaders will get to a point where the imperative is, the resignation imperative is, I want my country to progress. I feel that our citizens deserve better, and I don't think I'm in position to do that. And based on that, I will resign. And not because, I'm waiting for the party to pile pressure. So hopefully, Africa will get to that point where, our politicians have the moral authority to drive change and be able to say, I can't manage this. I'm stepping, down.
Then I think I want to combine that with with the whole AU reform process. We all need to understand that we're in this for the long haul. It's going to be a long, rough road. The South Africans, the Zimbabweans, the Ethiopians have shown us an indeed very, very important milestone that we can have a change of guard that is bloodless. If it is going to continue happening, it's actually a very long and impressive stride that at least those three guys have shown us that it is possible, and it is really fantastic. In the same breath, it is going to be painful to implement these self-financing reforms and all these other reforms that we're talking about at the AU. Let's prepare ourselves, and that's the thing that the leaders should be telling their electorate. That is where it's going to be a long, rough road.
And just to add to this, I'll give a personal, story. One of the I remember this was sometime last year, early last year or mid last year. No, I think after June, July, mid last year. The RCA, they run the...
Cricket Association?
No, I know you're passionate about cricket. The Civil Aviation Authority, the airports. Yes. RCAA, sorry. Yeah. No, we'll discuss cricket another time. I know you're passionate about cricket, but the airport authority basically came up with this increase in price of parking tickets. I remember to go to the airport at one point, we paid 500 francs and then 1,000, and then just in 2017, it was 3,000 francs. And I, amongst many, thought, wow, that's a 300% hike, And on social media, I remember there's just a lot of hullabaloo around this price hike. But what I came to understand after is that, in our quest to self-finance ourselves as a country, as Rwanda, there are going to be increases here and there, just so we can understand that the value in increases goes to a certain framework where we can finance ourselves. So we can actually dance to our own tune. And I remember thinking that, it's in Kiswahili they say funga mkanda, like just tighten the belt for a bit.
Yes.
And I think it's going to be tight for us. If you drop me at the airport next time, even though you're just passing through, you'll pay 3,000 francs.
Yeah.
But your children and my children, in 2 or 3 decades to come,
we'll see a few more restaurants at the airport.
Exactly. There'll be developments that, it's our generation, I think, we're at the cusp of something great, I think, as Rwanda, and I hope continentally.
Yes.
But this is some of the, and this goes back to that 0.2 percent levy. It's a point right now in time where we just have to understand that this is it's a long-term
Yes,
goal.
we're in it for the long haul.
We're in it for the long haul. And but Brenna, when we're talking about leadership, one of the things I also want to discuss, leadership, is this horrific, horrendous, and horrible events that have been happening in Libya, the migrant crisis. And as a Rwandan, as I'm sure I can speak for us, I'm proud to see that my country offered to host, I think, 30,000. But I know the AU actually looked into this, and they set up a tripartite committee, and they sent their diplomatic members to go to Libya and see how they can repatriate, members of whatever countries they come from. And those who are not willing to go back to their countries, I know Rwanda and Nigeria have offered to host them. So far, there are 12,000 people who, I think, in refugee camps are being repatriated and what have you. But what I just want to hear your opinion is that, in 2018, how can this be happening? And as the poet, the Somali-born poet Warsan Shara said, no one leaves home unless it's the mouth of a shark. These people are not crossing on little boats with the possibility to drown, because that is better than where they're coming from. What does this say about leadership? Do you think this is something that the AU will try and tackle? Because this migrant crisis kind of happened around the same time when Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe was resigning, but the AU, and rightly so, and as a journalist, you know how this is, they focused on this transition, which made more news, but the AU has been accused of not taking a collectively stronger voice in dealing with this migrant issue. What's
I know Banao is itching to say something about this, but there was a happening yesterday in Rwanda with refugees that we have from the DRC that are in Karongi district, in the southern province. And there was, I'm not sure about the numbers, but there was a massive demonstration where quite a number of them left the refugee camps and went to protest against their lifestyle and everything, the way they were being treated and the allocation and the allowances at the UNHCR offices in Karongi. Now, what immediately came into my mind was those were a few hundreds of people, that something has gone wrong somewhere in the way they are being managed, that they are unhappy and they have moved to UNHCR offices to revolt against the way they are being handled. Do we then have the capacity to handle tens of thousands of people? That might be a conversation for another day.
Absolutely.
But yeah,
we need to discuss that, yeah.
I think that tickled my mind. You know, it is definitely a huge governance gap and leadership gap in the countries where those refugees come from. But it got me thinking that from a self-reflection perspective as a country, you know, it was probably a wake-up call that when the tens of thousands come in, we need to be absolutely ready with a lot of handcuffs.
Can I?
Why handcuffs?
No, but can I be frank?
That wasn't a lighter note, really.
But just very quickly,
yes.
it is historically proven that migrants usually, out of a scale of 1 to 10, 8%, 8 out of 10, benefits the host nation that they're migrating.
That's what I was about to say.
You look at the US, they actually benefit.
I was going to say, because he talked of the refugee crisis. I have the privilege of being part of a team helping ARC, American Refugee Committee, come up with more innovative ways to engage within people in the camp.
Does that include rationing their sugar?
I wish they could allow me to service, but no. The fundamental thing that we have seen is that in themselves, camps are economies, they're microeconomies. And the question is, how do you fully engage these microeconomies to be able, like she said, to benefit the host nation? You'll find that, again, a huge portion of these people are not being managed well, like probably in that Karongi situation. But at the heart of it, if these people come in and if it's done the way we've always done it, I think Rwanda is really good at managing refugees. And I think partly also because of our own experiences and we kind of know, we've been on both sides of the spectrum. I don't see it being an issue. As long as we have the resources to do so and create those microeconomies,
and the frameworks to actually handle this influx.
It will be good for us. It will be good for us.
Totally
so
agree.
just very quickly, my next question is to you, Ephraim, and you touched on this, and I really want you to expand a bit. You know, you spoke before of generational, you know, from colonialism to the OAU to today, the urgency with which our leaders are actually revisiting ideals and implementation of these ideals in Africa on a generational basis. And this is something you mentioned that I'd like you to just expound on.
Yeah, you know, the reason why you see this change in, or at least what seems like a nuanced approach to governance and politics, is because the generation of leaders we have now, and why also 22 of the member states are for this. You know, why funding has been the highest since 1993. The contributions have been the highest since 1993. The reason why is because these leaders have reached a point where they're like, we need to do better. And the reason why is that when you look at most of these leaders, they're the generation, they were either born slightly before independence, during independence, or slightly after independence. So for them, they don't have the hang-ups that our parents had in relation to the colonialists. That's why even self-financing is such a big deal. They're like, we are responsible for ourselves. We are the ones supposed to take care of ourselves. No one else is supposed to do that. But our parents before them, so the colonialists come in with TVs. Okay, no, they didn't come in with TVs. But came in with...
we had sugar.
We had sugar.
White robes.
Came in with white robes, with forks, with knives.
Maybe forks and knives.
With religion as well,
Okay,
with their own brand of religion.
Yes,
with the Bible. They came in with what they called the Western democracy. They came in with different things that appeased our parents, and I mean, or at least our grandparents of the generation before them. And what happened was, for them, when they were given the responsibility to take over, they were kind of like a spoiled child, in the sense that, you know, if you take a child who has been babied and been spoon-fed, and you tell them, now take care of yourself, they're going to keep going back to you for support. And that's what happened. And it was a form of neocolonialism. These guys were like, these people can't depend on themselves. So we still do.
Like the French colonial tax, this is something to discuss for another day.
Yeah, exactly.
But the fact that, you know, there are countries in Francophone Africa. In fact, why do we even say Anglophone Africa or Francophone Africa?
Africa.
We are harking back to our colonizers.
Exactly.
You
So
know,
like
what's happening
English-
in Cameroon at the moment.
Yes, with
Yes,
the
yes,
English and the French.
And
People
they're
tearing
Cameroonian.
each other. And they're all Cameroonian.
Exactly. Why don't you talk about your indigenous language and
Yes,
get
yeah.
over it?
Yes.
You know, but you see, at the end of the day, because of that perspective by the older generation, you find that that's why we were not self-financing. That's why we depended heavily on them for aid. That's why we were passive in running our countries. We took
a back seat.
Yes, in our heads, an efficient government was non-existent because we're like, oh, somebody will just supplement our budget. Somebody will just supplement our budget. Kind of like a kid who's like, I don't necessarily need to work because my parents are gonna pay my rent. You know, at the core of it, if we can. This new generation are like, that cannot happen, and that's why they believe that self-financing is at the heart of it, or at least that's why 22 members of the 54 believe self-financing is at the heart of it.
Well, just to recap, we are going to go to our fact box, and Brenna, please take us through it.
The import tax, just give you a snapshot of the few key issues. The AU budget in 2016 was about 416 million. The new financing model will raise about 1.2 billion if each state member pays, of course, the 0.2 import bill. And of course, the AU reforms are led by the new chair, His Excellency Paul Kagame, and will focus one, the key priorities are around the continental scope. The second is realigning AU institutions to deliver on its priorities. 3, managing the AU effectively at both the political and operational level. Last, sustainably and self-financing of the AU. Those are the key reforms that we hope within 1 year will be addressed.
Progressively.
We'll be back after the break. Please stay tuned. So we've come to the end of this show. This has been an exciting conversation and debate. First edition of The Square. Please be sure to catch us on RBA, Rwanda Television, every Wednesday at 9 p.m. Our social media feed, at least on Twitter for now, is #TheSquareRW. But before we actually sign off, I'd like us to just, give a few closing remarks on this debate, the AU reforms under the chairmanship of His Excellency President Paul Kagame, and what they mean for the continent.
I think that the reform process is not a walk in the park. And I'm sure that the people who are in charge are aware of that. It's bold, but it's doable. It's ambitious, it can be done.
Charles?
I think it's clever that they have done a committee that comprises of the past chairman, the incumbent, and the incoming chairman. So that then allows some sense of continuity towards that. That will be extremely pivotal in ensuring that there is a follow-up and a success, and the allusion towards the reforms and the processes being associated with an individual will be reduced significantly to that. We look forward.
And accountability.
Yes.
Personally, I hope that these reforms happen in my generation, in our generation. Hopefully, I believe they will.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Yes.
But these reforms, they have to happen. But most importantly, I think, we're here at the Square, we're discussing them. I think influencers, especially in youth, should contribute to this conversation, should be participant in this conversation and implementing these reforms. We need young people to actually believe in them and drive this conversation forward. And hopefully it can happen in our generation. Ephraim, your closing remarks?
2 words, self-financing.
And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning into The Square every Wednesday on Rwanda Television at 9 p.m. Thank you for joining us.